This paper is about productivity differences across provinces in Indonesia and the determinants of those productivity differences. The motivation is that when we study regional differences over time, the key feature of analysis is economic convergence. And economic convergence is important for regional cohesion and competitiveness. In the literature of Indonesia in particular, there has been a growing literature that documents that income disparities are pervasive across provinces, and more recently, it has been documented across districts. And in this context, improvements in labor productivity and its determinants might help reduce regional income disparities. Motivated by these developments in the literature, this paper studies the evolution of regional disparities in labor productivity and its determinants, be those capital accumulation and efficiency, across provinces. And the particular emphasis of this study is the formation of multiple local convergence clubs. Essentially, what we have in mind is a framework where we will study the cross-sectional dynamics of labor productivity as a function of the cross-sectional dynamics of physical capital, human capital, and efficiency. To do that, we used a nonlinear dynamic factor model that was developed by Phillips and Suhl. And we also used the clustering algorithm that these authors propose for finding local convergence clubs. The data comes from the work of Kataoka, who, in a series of papers, has developed some provincial level accounts in terms of labor productivity, physical capital, human capital, and efficiency. We will be using 26 provinces over the 1990-2010 period. The main findings are as follows. First, the cross-provincial dynamics of labor productivity are characterized by two convergence clubs. And when we study the determinants of those clubs, the results are contrasting in the following sense. Physical capital and human capital have multiple clubs, similar to labor productivity, but two alternative measures of efficiency are suggesting one club. So one possible interpretation of these results is that the two convergence clubs of labor productivity are essentially driven by the multiple convergence clubs that are observed in physical and human capital. On the other hand, there seems to be much more cohesion or convergence in terms of efficiency across provinces in Indonesia. This presentation is divided into three parts. First, I will outline some facts. Then I will provide an intuition for the convergence framework that we are using in this paper. And then I will present some details of the main results, which are related to the two convergence clubs of labor productivity, the four convergence clubs of physical capital, the two convergence clubs of human capital, and the unique convergence club of efficiency. First, some stylized facts. Well, what you see here is the evolution of labor productivity over time and across provinces. When I study the evolution across provinces, essentially I am using the quantiles of the distribution. And what we can see in this graph is that the 95th quantile is particularly separated from the other quantiles. Essentially, here you can see that over time, there has been improvement in all these quantiles. However, the gap across quantiles, in particular, the gap from the bottom quantile, from the top quantile, has been large, and it's still considerably constant over time. Now, what happens when we study a similar, when we plot a similar graph for the determinants of labor productivity? We see some similarities. So, for instance, physical capital is also showing us that over time, there has been an improvement in all the selected quantiles. However, the gaps across quantiles remain there, and they are fairly large. In particular, the gap between the top quantile and the following quantiles is fairly wide. However, when we study the other determinants, the results are a little bit different, in the sense that this huge gap in between the top quantile and the following quantiles is not as large when we study human capital. However, it's interesting that even in the human capital case, the initial gap that used to be very wide is still considerably wide at the end of the period. There is some progress, but there is no a lot of progress. In terms of efficiency, it's interesting that here the picture is much more clear, in the sense that the gaps used to be fairly large at the beginning of the period, and they are smaller at the end of the period. This is particularly sharper when we use a non-parametric measure of efficiency, where we can see that in the year 1990, for instance, there were huge differences across the quantiles of the distribution, but over time, those differences have been narrowing. Okay, so here we start having some hints, in the sense that the behavior of capital inputs are different. The behavior of capital input is different compared to that of the efficiency indicators. Now, what we try to do in this paper is to give more structure to these patterns and argue that, given that there are still large differences across provinces at the end of the period, to what extent those differences are reflecting differences in convergence clubs. And to do that, we need to define first a framework of convergence. And the framework that we're using is based on the famous paper by now of Phillips and Sewell. And the intuition of this paper is that we will be studying for a variable, and this variable is going to be normalized by the cross-sectional average. If you want, it's going to be the level of income of province A divided by the average of all provinces. And we will study the dynamics of this relative income measure, or as it is known in the literature, this transition parameter. We will study the behavior of this parameter, but we will focus on the gaps across regions and over time. And in this context, we define a measure of variance, and we are going to define convergence as the case where the cross-sectional variance converges to 0, or the relative parameter converges to 1 over time. Okay? The framework that Phillips and Sewell proposed is based on this regression. And this regression essentially is trying to study the dynamics of the cross-sectional variance over time. So here we have the cross-sectional variance in the initial period, and then we are going to track this ratio relative to the behavior of the variance in future periods, right? And the intuition of this regression is as follows. So on the vertical axis, we have a function that is the ratio of cross-sectional variances, and on the horizontal axis, I have time. In this framework, convergence is going to be defined when the cross-sectional gaps, or in this case, the provincial gaps at the end of the period, let's call it HT, are smaller than the income gaps at the beginning of the period. If the income gaps at period T are smaller than the income gaps at the initial period, we make a connection between these 2 points, and if there is a positive slope in the context of the previous regression equation, the slope has to be, if the slope is positive, we can argue that there is a convergence pattern. In contrast, if the cross-sectional income gaps are larger at the end of the period than they used to be at the beginning of the period, then there is a negative slope here, and this is suggesting divergence. Okay, this is a rough intuition of what the framework of Phillips and Sewell is doing. Essentially, here I'm using just 2 points of time, whereas in the former equation, in the previously mentioned equation, we use many points of time. But the intuition is the same. We want to measure the slope of this relative of this variance ratio. Now, the second part of the framework allows us to measure convergence clubs. And the intuition is that, for instance, we can have 4 countries or regions or 4 economies. And if those economies converged over time, it is possible that they can converge to multiple convergence clubs. Like, for instance, region A and B are converging towards club 1, that is systematically above the average, whereas regions C and D are converging towards club 2, which is systematically below the average. We want to see to what extent this is happening across the provinces in Indonesia. So here are the results. First, let's study that coefficient of the regression. As you can see, if you remember, if the coefficient is negative, there is divergence. And if the coefficient is positive, there is convergence. And here, the coefficient for labor productivity, physical capital, and human capital is negative and it's statistically significant. And for efficiency, we find the opposite. We have a positive coefficient suggesting convergence. And to some extent, we had some hints in the stylized facts that I presented before. But the interesting part of this methodology is to find out if there is lack of overall convergence, what are the chances of observing local convergence? And in particular, how many local convergence clubs can be identified, and what are the components of those convergence clubs? In labor productivity, there are 2, and the difference is striking. And there is a big difference between club number 1 and club number 2. And it seems that club number 1 is approaching club number 2, but at a very slow speed. And moreover, club number 1 is very small. It only has 2 provinces, whereas most provinces are located in club number 2. And there is very little progress towards convergence in club number 2. If we want to know the membership of the provinces, well, club number 1 is composed by Jakarta and East Kalimantan, and we see clearly that the transition of these 2 provinces has been converging over time. Club number 2 is composed by the remaining provinces, and here we recover convergence in the sense that the gaps at the beginning of the period were larger than the gaps at the end of the period. And clearly we see a pattern of convergence that is far from complete. If anything, club 1 and club 2 are converging at a higher speed, whereas the members of club number 2 are approaching convergence, but the process is far from complete. What about physical capital? In physical capital, we find 4 clubs. And the interesting part is that those clubs are not parallel. The tendencies, for instance, between club number 1 and club number 4, the tendency is between these 2 clubs is that these 2 clubs are separating over time, right? The gaps or the distance between these 2 clubs is increasing over time. In terms of club number 2 and number 3, there is a very interesting crossing where the performance of club number 2 used to be below the performance of club number 3. But now in recent years, club number 2 has been performing at a higher level than club number 3. In terms of composition, most provinces are located in club number 1. And here we can see that club number 1 is composed by these regions where the initial gap used to be higher, now it is smaller, and a similar pattern can be observed for the other clubs. Human capital. Human capital has 2 clubs. One is composed by 19 regions, provinces, and the other for 7 provinces. These are the components. And here, to some extent, we are trying to emphasize that the high heterogeneity is that is identified in labor productivity is reflecting the heterogeneity in human capital and physical capital. However, it's important to emphasize that efficiency has only one convergence club, but convergence by itself is not an indicator of good performance. Convergence is going to be a good thing, if you want, if provinces are converging towards a high level equilibrium. On the other hand, if provinces are converging towards a low level equilibrium, convergence is something undesirable. In this case, what is important to highlight is that the efficiency level in recent years has been lower than the efficiency level of Indonesia before 1995. In particular, what we try to suggest in this part of the paper is that although provinces are converging in terms of efficiency, they are converging to a lower level, right? And we should emphasize that that's a problem, and in order to improve or reduce labor productivity differences, it's not only to convert, converging in terms of efficiency is not the only thing. It's more important to converge to a higher level of productivity or even diverge from a low level of productivity. And the key message of this paper is that although efficiency is the only variable where we identify convergence, is not yet a high level convergence. It's still a low level convergence, and Indonesian provinces can still benefit from increasing their level of efficiency. Okay, just some concluding remarks. First, we reject the overall convergence hypothesis in labor productivity and two of its determinants. Those are physical capital and human capital. We find a unique convergence club in terms of efficiency. However, we emphasize that this is a low efficiency club, and this we can even discuss and we can argue that this is a low efficiency trap. In terms of the implication, discussions, and further research, regional heterogeneity is a pervasive feature in Indonesia, and also in many developing countries. And it's important to use an analytical framework that focuses on heterogeneity and goes beyond the average. In particular, in regions that show such large differences in terms of income or in terms of endowments. From an analytical point of view, the convergence clubs approach that we present in this paper help us identify economies that are facing similar challenges. These similar challenges calls for better coordination and cooperation policies, both within and between clubs. And we would like to conclude mentioning that masked within provinces, there is still a high degree of heterogeneity that is still worth exploring. Essentially, now we would like to reevaluate these convergence clubs using much more disaggregated data, in particular using district level data, and see to what extent we can find multiple convergence clubs. Well, that's it. If you want to keep following with the developments of this research project, all our progress is going to be documented in the website of the Quarks Lab. And thank you for your attention.